This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. I want you to close your eyes, metaphorically anyway. You can keep watching the video, but clear your mind. Got it? Okay, now I want you to imagine what the music of the 1980s sounded like. Don't picture a specific song, band, or even genre. Try to hear the decade. Like, if I wanted to play you a song and the only thing I told you about it was that it was recorded in 1986, what would you expect to hear? Is it something like this? Yeah, that's what I thought. That sound is the Yamaha DX7 synthesizer, or more precisely the EPN01 preset, and to be clear, yes, there were other good answers too. Maybe you thought of electronic drum kits, or if you're a metalhead like me, you might have been hearing a shotgun snare. But when you listen to music from the 80s, you pretty quickly notice that across genres, EPN01 is everywhere. Heck, at the height of its popularity in 1986, it showed up in over 60% of Billboard's #1 R&B singles, and around 40% of the #1 singles on the country and Hot 100 charts too. And to be clear, those numbers aren't for the DX7 in general, that got used even more. This is just one preset, one omnipresent sound that came to define what it means to be musically 80s. It's one of the most instantly recognizable tones in all of modern music, and my friend Dr. Megan Lavengood decided to figure out why. But first, a little history. The first recognizably modern synthesizer was produced by theremin manufacturer Robert Moog in 1964. A few earlier synths existed, but they were the size of a room and ran on punch cards. Moog, along with composer Herbert Deutsch, shrank the machinery to a slightly more manageable size and introduced a keyboard so it could be played in real time like an actual instrument. Still though, the whole thing sold for around $10,000 or over $80,000 in today's money, so these were not easily accessible, but with the help of Wendy Carlos and other early adopters, the Moog introduced the world to the concept of analog synthesis and began the synthesizer revolution. At its heart, analog synthesis works by generating a signal, then passing that signal through a series of amplifiers, modulators, envelopes, and other technical sounding things in order to create a specific tone with a high degree of control and accuracy. In the original Moog design, this was done with cables that physically linked different units together, but as the technology advanced, you got newer synths like the Mini Moog or the Roland Jupiter 8 that kept all that machinery inside, making them both easier to move and easier to afford. Still though, even the Jupiter 8 cost over $5,000 on its release in 1981, which is about $15,000 today, well out of most people's price ranges. But around that time, another technology was rapidly becoming cheaper and more powerful: the computer. It wasn't long before engineers started to wonder if they could use digital technology to make synths cheap enough to appeal to the mass market. Early attempts at digital synths still aimed at the high end, while 1979's Fairlight CMI was adopted by major artists like Stevie Wonder, Peter Gabriel, and Kate Bush. It cost $25,000, or almost $90,000 today, making it even more expensive than the original Moog. But digital synthesis finally broke through in 1983 with the release of the Yamaha DX7, the first truly affordable synth. At a price of just under $2,000, around $5,000 today, it still wasn't cheap, but I'd be willing to bet that a lot of people watching this video have spent at least that much on guitars, so, you know, glass houses and whatnot. The DX7 was a serious piece of machinery with a price tag to match, but at a third the cost of the Jupiter 8, it was well within the range that a professional musician might expect to pay for gear, and that relative affordability led to an explosion of interest in digital synths. Like analog synths before it, the DX7 allowed the end user almost complete control over the timbre or tone of the instrument. They could modify dozens of different settings in order to craft the perfect sound. However, the interface you had to use in order to do that was notoriously difficult, so while some adventurous artists like Brian Eno dove in headfirst and started inventing their own sounds, most musicians stuck with one of the 128 presets built into the DX7. And while many of those presets saw at least some use, by far the most popular sound, and the one most strongly associated with the DX7 today, was a preset called EPN01 designed to imitate the timbre of the Fender Rhodes. Now, the Rhodes was not a synthesizer, it was an electric piano, which meant that while it had electronic components, the sound was initially generated by a physical process. When you pressed a key, it caused a hammer to strike a small metal bar, creating a tone that the Rhodes would pick up, run through some filters, and amplify. You can think of it like an electric guitar. When you hit the strings, they ring out, and if the room is quiet enough, you can even hear it, but you need to plug it into an amp for the sound to really project. But while EPN01 was supposed to sound like the Rhodes, the limitations of the technology meant it was pretty easy to tell them apart. Here's the Rhodes, and here's the DX7 imitating it. They're clearly related, but there's also some obvious differences which were discussed at length by contemporary musicians. While it'd be impossible to summarize the entire debate here, Dr. Lavengood keyed in on two main descriptors that seemed to keep popping up over and over. The Rhodes was considered warm, while the DX7 was bright. Now that may seem like a weird distinction, since in the real world bright things tend to be warm and vice versa, but when discussing an instrument's timbre, these two adjectives seem to be opposites. They're fairly imprecise though. What is a warm tone? What makes an instrument bright? What do these words actually mean? Well, the answer answer to that may lie in their frequency spectra. You see, on this channel, I often say that when you hear a note, what you're really hearing is a sound wave with a specific frequency, and that's true, but it's only part of the story. Most of the time, when you hear a note produced by any physical process, you're actually hearing a whole family of frequencies smushed together into one apparent tone. The lowest frequency, called the fundamental frequency, is what defines the pitch of the note. This note has a fundamental of around 350 Hz or cycles per second, which happens to be the pitch we call F. But in addition to that fundamental, the note also has what are called overtones, additional higher frequencies that are usually multiples of the fundamental. So in addition to 350 Hz, we're also hearing shades of 700 Hz, 1050, 1400, and so on. These blend together too well to really come across as their own pitches. They just add color to the fundamental, and the relative strengths of these overtones is most of what we call timbre. This gives us the tools we need in order to examine exactly how EPN01 differs from the Fender Rhodes, which in turn might help us better understand what makes a tone sound bright versus warm in general. Which actual timbres do those terms describe? Well, after running both sounds through a frequency analyzer, Dr. Lavengood identified three main differences between them. The first is range. While in theory the overtone series continues to infinity, in practice you're only going to have a limited number of perceptible overtones on any given instrument. For the Rhodes, the highest overtone you can actually detect is a little over 3 octaves above the fundamental, while the range of the DX7's harmonic series is almost 4. This matches a lot of other research that shows we tend to hear notes with higher overtones as brighter. But there's other differences too. While the DX7 has higher overtones, the Rhodes has more of them. It has a total of 11 perceptible frequencies compared to EPN01's 9. In fact, EPN01 has a run of 5 overtones in a row that are just missing. This gives it a hollow, empty sound compared to the rich, full tone of the Rhodes. It's less muddy, but it also lacks a little character, making it feel cold, dispassionate, and mechanical next to the warmer, more human Rhodes. But those of you who know the harmonic series may have noticed a problem with those last two stats. If the Rhodes has a 3-octave spectrum, how can it have 11 overtones? As I mentioned earlier, overtones are multiples of the fundamental, and if you want to go up 3 octaves, you have to multiply that fundamental by 8. This means there's only 8 harmonics that fit within that range, so where are the other 3 coming from? Well, as is so often the case, things aren't quite as simple as they seem. You see, overtones can be broken up into 2 categories. The first is harmonic overtones, which are the ones we've been talking about so far. They're multiples of the fundamental, and they sound in harmony with it. Inharmonic overtones, on the other hand, are not multiples. They're bonus frequencies, and they clash with the overall structure of the tone. That might sound like a bad thing, and in a sense, it is. Inharmonic overtones are why, say, a snare drum doesn't really have an apparent pitch. Too many different parts are rattling around at different frequencies, and our ears can't sort them into a clear structured harmonic series with a single identifiable fundamental. While you can tune a snare to sound higher or lower, it's never really gonna sound like an actual note. But the Rhodes is a lot more careful. While it contains 3 inharmonic overtones, they're all fairly high in its frequency spectrum. They don't start showing up until we're already 2.5 octaves above the fundamental, so while they disrupt the harmonic structure of the pitch, they don't destroy it. You still hear a note, there's just some extra decoration going on at the top end of the timbre. This is a product of the way the Rhodes generate sound. Again, unlike the DX7, it starts with a physical process. A hammer strikes a metal bar, and that percussive event adds these inharmonic overtones, which gives the note a bit more personality. You can think of it like the difference between a major triad and a major 7th chord. They're both major, but the 7th makes it feel more nuanced and complex. Taken together, these give us a pretty good idea of what sets these two instruments apart. The Rhodes has a smaller, more densely packed spectrum with some inharmonicity at the top end, all of which we perceive as warm, while EPN01 has a broader, emptier range with only harmonic overtones, which sounds bright instead. In order to test these results, Dr. Lavengood took her original samples and modified them to remove these characteristics, cutting out the high end and dampening the frequencies where the inharmonic overtones appeared, and if you listen to those, it's a lot harder to tell which is which. There's still some difference, but it's much more subtle. So is that it? Well, not quite. There's one variable we haven't considered yet. Humans. Unsurprisingly, the people with the strongest opinions in the Rhodes DX7 debate were keyboardists, whose impressions of the instruments were affected not just by their sound, but by the experience of playing them. It's no secret that our senses are connected. Any chef can tell you that how food looks and smells has a profound impact on how it tastes, so it seems likely that when playing an instrument, the way you experience its sound would be inextricably linked to the tactile experience of creating that sound. The Fender Rhodes is a physical instrument producing sound through a physical process. It responds to your touch. If you press a little harder, the hammer strikes a little stronger. You feel a connection to the instrument. It becomes an extension of your body. The DX7, though, can't give you that. It's touch sensitive, sure, but that sensitivity is limited, quantized, reduced to numbers that the computer decides what to do with. You're not enacting a physical process. You don't have that same feedback, that sense that you're the one making the sound happen. The DX7 doesn't need you, it just needs a signal. This creates a disconnect between the player and the instrument, both physically and emotionally, that would almost certainly affect the perceived character of the sound, especially back when the technology was unfamiliar and new. And this affects listeners too, even if you've never played the DX7, in the world of the 1980s where digital technology was still fairly new to most people and its powers were pretty limited, just knowing that what you were hearing was a digital imitation of a beloved instrument like the Fender Rhodes could make it feel hollow, inhuman, and cold, so maybe the real reason for the distinction between the two instruments lies not in their frequency spectra, but in ourselves. Or more likely, it lies in a combination of the two. Music is art made of sound, and our experience of it is influenced both by the sound itself and by the cultural context in which it's made. I think pretty much any listener from any time period could tell the difference between this and this, but would they describe them as warm and bright, respectively? Would they draw the same lines we did, or would they find something new here, some other emotional framework for the same set of frequencies? Stripped of the context of the 1980s, would we hear these sounds differently? At the time, EPiano-1 and the DX7 became symbols of modernity, of technology, and of the future, and these days they evoke a sort of retro-futurism, a look at what the past thought the present might be. It lacks the warmth and humanity of what came before it, replaced with the brightness and clarity promised by the digital revolution. Those associations are intrinsically linked with our knowledge of the 1980s, but they begin with the instrument's sound. If you want to know more about the history of the synthesizer, my friend Volksgeist released a deep dive on that very topic over on Nebula. It's a great companion piece for this video, covering everything from early experiments to the rise of the Moog and the DX7, all the way through the technology's lasting influence today. In case you don't know, Nebula is a new streaming service built by some of YouTube's top educators, including Lindsay Ellis, Legal Eagle, Polyphonic, and me. Plus, we've got Adam Neely now. He signed on like a month ago, I think, maybe a bit more. If you want to check out Nebula, we've even made a deal with CuriosityStream, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream with a link in the description, not only will you get to watch their massive library with thousands of great documentaries, you'll also get free access to Nebula along with it for as long as you remain a CuriosityStream member. And now's a great time to sign up, because if you use the link in the description, you'll also get a 26% discount on their annual plan. That's a year of access to both sites starting under $15. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Susan Jones and Jill Sundgaard. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.